For more than 60 years, Pastor John Hagee built one of the most powerful ministries in America, a church of 20,000 members, television broadcasts reaching 99 million homes, and books on the New York Times bestseller list. But behind that empire, something has been quietly falling apart. Old sermons keep resurfacing on social media. Donors are asking questions about his lifestyle. Critics who stayed silent for decades are finally speaking out. At 85 years old, the preacher who once stood next to presidents is now facing the kind of scrutiny he spent a lifetime avoiding. John Charles Hagee was born on April 12, 1940, in Goose Creek, Texas, a refinery town near Houston. He was the second of 4 sons born to William Bethel and Veda Hagee, and from the start, church life surrounded him. Both parents were deeply involved in Pentecostal ministry. At Reagan High School in Houston, he became a National Honor Society student and earned varsity letters in 4 sports. Football became his strongest path, and he rose to team captain, eventually earning a commission to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Then everything changed in one night. On the second Thursday of January 1958, 17-year-old John sat on the back pew of his father's church during a revival service. He had quietly planned to leave church behind. He had sports, West Point, and a future that seemed already mapped out. But during the altar invitation, he later said he felt an overwhelming call. He got up from the back row, walked to the front, and accepted what he believed was a call into full-time ministry. The next morning, he withdrew from Reagan High School and enrolled immediately at Southwestern Bible Institute in Waxahachie, Texas. In less than 2 days, his life had turned completely. By March 1958, he preached his first sermon at his father's church. In 1962, he secured a full athletic scholarship to Trinity University in San Antonio, completing a bachelor's degree in history and education by 1964. After Trinity, he moved into coaching at Nimitz Middle School, where his teams won district championships in football, track, and basketball. Then, in 1965, he enrolled at North Texas State University and earned a master's degree in educational administration by 1966. That set him apart from many pastors of his generation. He added graduate-level training in leadership, which would later shape how he built institutions far beyond a single pulpit. By October 1966, at just 26 years old, he founded Trinity Church in San Antonio. Within 6 years, the congregation had expanded into a larger sanctuary. Then came another sharp turn. In May 1975, Hagee resigned suddenly as senior pastor and took over a struggling congregation of about 25 people in Castle Hills. He renamed it the church, and what looked like a smaller stage became the foundation for everything that followed. In 1976, he married Diana Castro. The timing mattered because the marriage came while the new congregation was still small and uncertain. Still, he kept pushing for growth. By 1987, the congregation moved to a much larger campus and took on a new name, Cornerstone Church. Over the years that followed, Cornerstone claimed more than 20,000 active members, making it one of the largest churches in Texas. As the church expanded, so did the media side of his work. Through global evangelism television, his sermons were broadcast on more than 160 television stations and 50 radio stations, reaching around 99 million homes worldwide. Reports from the early 2000s described the Hagee enterprise as bringing in more than $18 million in revenue in a single year, with personal salary and benefits that drew close scrutiny. His public profile kept growing through books. By 2018, press releases described him as a New York Times best-selling author with nearly 40 books to his name, including For Blood Moons and Absolute Power. By 2020, descriptions of his work often referred not just to a church, but to a media empire. At the center of much of his preaching was a message about wealth and prosperity. He quoted Deuteronomy 8 verse 18 and told listeners that it is God's will for them to prosper. He pushed the phrase, giver's gain, and connected Luke 6 verse 38 to the idea that giving money would lead to material blessing. He also described poverty as a curse and taught that people did not qualify for God's abundance until they gave. That message became one of the most debated parts of his ministry. Critics argued he was using Scripture to support a system of fundraising built around promises of blessing and return. The criticism grew sharper around his use of what many called seed theology. Watchdog ministries argued that passages were being removed from their original context and turned into tools for money appeals. Supporters heard promise and encouragement. Opponents heard manipulation. Questions about money also followed him personally. Some online commentators in 2025 claimed his net worth was around $50 million. Other estimates placed it much lower, around $5 to $6 million based on salary, book royalties, and ministry income. Earlier investigative work noted that before restructuring part of his nonprofit operation in 2004, he was among the highest-paid nonprofit executives in San Antonio, with annual compensation close to $1 million for limited weekly hours. In an era where televangelists like Kenneth Copeland have faced renewed scrutiny over private jets and lavish lifestyles, sparking congressional inquiries into religious financial transparency. Hagee's compensation has drawn similar questions from critics who see a disconnect between prosperity preaching and apostolic simplicity. His support for Israel was deeply tied to his end-times theology. He taught that the modern state of Israel was central to God's plan for history and often described it as the stopwatch for what would happen to nations until the rapture. In his 2006 book, Jerusalem Countdown, he argued that conflict involving Israel, especially a future clash with Iran, would trigger the Gog and Magog battles from Ezekiel and move the world closer to the return of Jesus. This was not a side note in his theology. It was a major engine behind his message and public activism. In the late 1990s, John Hagee gave a sermon that would follow him for years. While preaching from Jeremiah 16, he focused on the line about God sending many fishers and then many hunters to drive Jews back to Israel. From there, he made the remark that stunned critics. He said God sent a hunter, then added that Hitler was a hunter. He described a hunter as someone with a gun, someone who forces you. Hagee's message was that the Holocaust happened because God allowed it, since bringing Jews back to the land was God's top priority for the Jewish people. That interpretation horrified many because it seemed to treat Nazi mass murder as part of divine purpose instead of naming it plainly as genocide. That was not the only reason people accused him of anti-Semitic thinking. In other comments, Hagee was documented saying Hitler came from a line of what he called cursed, genocidally murderous half-breed Jews. The pattern became even darker when Hagee brought Jewish banking families into his end-times teaching. In books and television sermons, he repeated claims that the Rothschilds stood at the center of a private network controlling the Federal Reserve and global finance. For critics, this drew from one of the oldest anti-Semitic myths in circulation, the fantasy that Jewish bankers secretly run the world. By May 2008, those old sermons were no longer buried. Audio of the Hitler sermon resurfaced on political blogs and cable news. Senator John McCain rejected Hagee's endorsement in public and called the comments deeply offensive and indefensible. That moment mattered because McCain's campaign had first welcomed Hagee's support as a way to reach evangelical voters. Once reporters started digging through the older sermons, the political cost became too obvious to ignore. The same history returned in force on November 14, 2023, after Hagee was invited to pray at the March for Israel rally on the National Mall following the Hamas attacks of October 7th. Jewish writers and commentators immediately brought back the Hitler sermon and the half-breed Jews remarks. Many said putting Hagee on that stage was a moral disgrace. Critics pointed out that his conspiracy language about Jewish bankers and the Antichrist had continued well into the 2020s. This did not feel like a faded controversy. It felt current. He also built a reputation through attacks on Catholics, Muslims, women, and gay people. For years, he preached that the Catholic Church was a great apostate church and a false cult system. Catholic leaders pushed back hard. By 2008, under heavy pressure, Hagee sent a letter to the Catholic League expressing deep regret for comments Catholics had found hurtful. The Catholic League accepted the letter and declared the matter closed. Even so, his earlier statements stayed in circulation. His remarks about Islam caused the same kind of uproar. In a 2006 interview on NPR's Fresh Air, Hagee told Terry Gross that those who live by the Quran have a scriptural mandate to kill Christians and Jews. Critics called this plain Islamophobia. His culture war preaching reached women too. Hagee promoted a strongly patriarchal view of family life and taught that women were meant to be mothers and bear children, making domestic life their main purpose under God. For many critics, that message reduced women to a narrow role. His apocalyptic language could become even more inflammatory when different prejudices merged. In one case, he said the future Antichrist would be homosexual and partially Jewish. Jewish organizations condemned all of this as classic anti-Semitic material wrapped inside Christian Zionist language. The contradiction stood out clearly. Hagee presented himself as a fierce friend of Israel while repeating themes that recycled some of the oldest hostility toward Jews. This habit of giving disasters a prophetic meaning showed up repeatedly. On September 18, 2006, in an NPR interview, Hagee said Hurricane Katrina was the judgment of God on New Orleans. He argued that the city had reached a level of sin that offended God and pointed to a planned gay pride parade expected around the same time the storm struck. That framing outraged many because Katrina had killed more than 1,200 people. To describe such devastation as divine punishment sounded cruel to critics. The same pattern appeared again in 2014 when Hagee linked the Ebola outbreak to U.S. policy on Jerusalem, saying there were grounds to believe judgment had already begun because Obama had tried to divide Jerusalem. Money became another major point of scrutiny. In 2001, GTV reported more than $18 million in revenue on its IRS Form 990. Hagee's total compensation package came to nearly $1.25 million for that year. Those numbers placed him among the highest-paid nonprofit leaders in the area. That financial profile lined up with his preaching style. Hagee often tied giving to supernatural reward and told viewers that income is controlled by giving, and that there is no such thing as a fixed income in the kingdom of God. Critics said this created strong pressure on struggling believers. Former followers described appeals where offerings were connected to promises about mortgages, illness, and sudden change in fortune. Politics eventually wrapped around all of this. In November 2021, Cornerstone Church hosted a stop on the Reawaken America tour, a hard-right political event featuring Michael Flynn and Alex Jones. Video from the church sanctuary showed hundreds of attendees shouting, "Let's go Brandon," the coded insult aimed at President Joe Biden. The Freedom from Religion Foundation urged the IRS to investigate whether the gathering crossed the line for a tax-exempt church. Critics said the church had turned itself into the setting for a campaign-style rally. By this point, Hagee was also dealing with age and health. On October 4, 2020, his son Matt Hagee told the congregation that his 80-year-old father had tested positive for COVID-19. Reports said he spent at least 2 weeks under hospital-level care before returning to the pulpit in mid-November 2020. By 2023, write-ups described a man in his early 80s dealing with heart-related issues, visible signs of aging, and the strain from decades of ministry. Even so, he continued to preach regularly. At the same time, Cornerstone Church had begun moving into a new phase, with Matt Hagee increasingly presented as the lead pastor, while John remained the founding pastor and symbolic center of the ministry. Then, on November 14, 2023, the whole history seemed to circle back on itself. John Hagee appeared at the March for Israel rally in Washington, D.C., and his presence instantly revived the old arguments about Hitler, prophecy, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and the kind of political protection powerful religious figures often receive. Critics said his invitation undercut the very message the rally claimed to defend. Supporters saw something else, a longtime champion of Israel standing in a moment of crisis. That split reaction captured the larger story of John Hagee almost perfectly. For decades, he has been able to remain influential while carrying controversy right beside him. At 85, with his legacy being handed to his son and his old sermons more accessible than ever in the digital age, the scrutiny he spent a lifetime avoiding is finally catching up. things aren't looking well for Pastor John Hagee, and this time, there may be no sermon that can make it go away.